Welcome to another installment of Cowboys Deep Cuts. I am Edward Egros. We hope you have enjoyed our series on surviving the coronavirus pandemic, and we will return to that subject matter fairly soon in the coming weeks. But I think we need some semblance of sports right now. Unfortunately, the NFL draft provides just that. Cowboys have the 17th overall selection, 7 picks for the week, 2 in round 5, none in round 6. And joining me to break down a more thorough approach to forecasting the draft is Benjamin Robinson, a data scientist who's bringing his years of experience to the NFL draft. You can catch his work online at grindingthemocks.com. That's grindingthemocks.com. Benjamin, how are you holding up these days?
Good. And, thank you for getting the name of the site right. Sometimes I hear people call it mocking the draft, and I take the draft very seriously, Edward. So, grinding the mocks. Yep. Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be on with you.
Absolutely. Pleasure's all mine. And it's not just a pleasure to talk about the NFL draft, something about sports, but it's also nice to talk to a fellow R user who believes in shiny apps. So trust me, the feeling is mutual as far as excitement is concerned.
Great.
All right. Well, enough people have their own mock drafts. They've devised, things however they want. You have a different approach for creating your list, an ensemble method. Basically is the way to look at it, where you combine several mock drafts. How many exactly do you have in your model?
Well, we're not done yet. So the draft is tomorrow. I think by the time, I think there'll be around 2,500 mock drafts this year. But I don't know if I'll get there exactly because I'm not like a mock draft machine, although I wish I was. But yeah, it'll be close to 2,500, which is, a little bit better than last year. So there's some argument to be made that maybe that's too much data because it goes back quite a ways to the beginning of the end of last year's draft. So you kind of get a sense of what was the consensus really early on, but that has very little to say about what the consensus around players is or what the kind of the midpoint or the average is for what we're seeing in mock drafts now. And that's why, when I pull together all the data, that data gets weighted very, 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 very tiny. And the data that's being collected today and the data that I'm going to be collecting tomorrow gets weighted a lot more highly. So there should be a decent amount of movement, at least in some parts of the draft, depending on what people are mocking tonight and then also tomorrow. And then I'll be manually collecting all that data and then running the final model to get the final list of all the players, what I call expected draft positions.
It's interesting. I mean, 2,500 mock drafts. How in the world do you track all of these down and put them into your data?
Yeah, so there's some really nice, so Twitter is one way, but there's also some websites that kind of curate mock drafts. They'll have like a list of links. They'll sometimes call them mock draft databases. So there's some that are better than others, but mostly that's where I go. And at some point, if you, it's easier to find ones that get kind of posted over at the same link, because then I can just easily scrape that information using R. But otherwise, you just kind of got to track down the links, and some places are better about kind of maintaining the same format and consistency that makes my life so much easier. So it's kind of a little bit of all over the place, but that's one of the things that's made this stuff more fun to track in some ways, because this is not a kind of novel approach. I think I might be one of the first people to be doing this in a public setting. But NFL teams have been using mock drafts as data for probably at least some teams, not every team, because not all teams are equally sophisticated from an analytic perspective. But teams have been using mock draft kind of as data for years. You've heard about Mike Lombardi, the former NFL front office executive, talking about, hey, we'd use mock drafts to kind of figure out where we needed to go when we wanted to trade up to select Jerry Rice when he was with the 49ers, and then when he's with the Patriots, doing similar things. And so there's a lot to be said about some of this data, but we've got with the internet, we've got a lot more of this data than we've ever had. In the past, maybe you just you try to track down what mock drafts were being written by the major NFL beat writers, including in Dallas, the Dallas Morning News. I think Rich Gosselin. I don't think he writes for the Dallas Morning News anymore, but was known as someone who was really clued into the league and people really respected his opinion. So to me, these days, you have a lot of really respected people who are making mock drafts as well. And so, they're going for accuracy. But what I'm going for is less about the draft as a zero-sum game and more about the draft as we view it in an analytical way, which is there are any number of ways the draft itself could kind of come out if we did the draft 10,000 times. And so the mock drafts just give you a sense of what each player's range of expected outcomes could be. And so if you're viewing it from a fan perspective, it'll help you kind of, and I like to think about it from my perspective as a fan. And I also like to think about it as my perspective from someone who could be making draft decisions. You'd rather know, hey, is this player, are we selecting a player within their expected range? Because draft capital, we call it capital, we have limited. So you talked about the Cowboys, right? This is a Cowboys podcast. They have 7 draft picks. That's pretty decent. There's some teams that have a lot less, like the 49ers. And so when you have limited resources, you really want to do, in my opinion, is maximize the efficiency of those resources. And so that's how I view the draft is, hey, we have our limited resources, and the Cowboys do a pretty good job for the most part over the years of my data collection at maximizing their limited resources in the draft.
Definitely, and I want to get back to that in just a bit. And also, too, anytime we can mention Rick Gosselin, formerly the Dallas Morning News, it's always a good thing. Definitely one of my buddies as far as really appreciating the numbers and the analytical approaches. I think this may be more of a philosophical question, but I'd love your take on this because I know Daniel Jeremiah with the NFL Network, he believes that mock drafts may be less accurate this year because during this pandemic, teams are less likely to come together and have those casual conversations where teams kind of understand where everyone is supposed to fall in line. And yet my argument is actually, I think it's going to have the opposite effect where I think mock drafts could potentially be more accurate this year because every team is operating with less data, less information, right? They can't go to pro days. They can't have those in-person interviews. They can't acquire enough data on specific players. And so I think because there's more information out there than ever before to glean from, that this is an opportunity, say, for teams to look at what everyone has aggregated and said, okay, this is what the experts believe. This is what fans believe. Let's actually look at this. And then this is going to be in lieu of other information that we would acquire on our own.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a decent amount of groupthink that there's going to be less groupthink. And so to me, it makes a lot of sense. We all have the same information for the most part as the teams at this point. A lot of people have watched the film. People aren't going to have as much information about, what teams are actually thinking. But at the end of the day, I think the data this time around is actually pretty valuable, like you said. The teams, I still think that the teams are going to mostly hew to the same behavior that they've had recently. So I expect the Cowboys to be pretty decent at trying to have value in the draft. I expect the Seahawks to be very heterodox. I expect the 49ers to be relatively heterodox. I don't think that the group think that people think is going to go away is going to happen. I think humans we're fundamentally biased beings. And so, I'm with the Cade Masseys and the Richard Thaler's of the world when it comes to the rational irrationality of human beings. And so I think it's a little bit of folly to think that we can kind of just overcome those inherent biases that we have. I think that those have existed and been ingrained in folks for years. So I don't think that just now not having pro days, not having medical rechecks is going to make those things disappear. I mean, heck, Justin Herbert could be the second quarterback taken in the draft. And if that's not groupthink about whether you think that you can evaluate players just based on how they look instead of how they perform on the field, I don't know what is.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, Hazard Play, the other podcast we do on Vocal Media, my cohort, really buys into the reports that Miami loves Justin Herbert and would be willing to trade up for it. I trade up for him, and I don't like the move as far as Miami is concerned, both because of the player and because of losing a lot of draft surplus value that team has in particular. But at the same time, I look at this and go, I think, overcoming those biases are naturally difficult for all of us. And on top of that, because we're dealing in uncertain times and we have this new draft that we're doing through technology and computers and home war rooms, I think because we're throwing so many different conditions upon teams, that I think it's just naturally likelier to fall back upon your usual routines, which is your biases. And I think that's a good thing as far as trying to predict the draft, because we have history of this. We have data that can actually chronicle what those biases are.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of bias in this data set. There's no denying, because this data set is created by humans. Like pretty much almost any data set is biased. And so, to be honest, in the things that I've investigated, when I look at, this draft surplus value, which is just this difference between expected draft position and actual draft position, that there's quite a bit of bias in the data. And I wrote up a little piece, guest column for Football Outsiders, came out, I think, a couple weeks ago at this point, though time is just a passing construct these days. And, what we see is that the draft surplus value, kind of the difference, like I said, between expected and actual, it's really relatively small in the first round. And then it jumps up in the second round, it goes down in the third round, and then fourth through seventh round is kind of all over the place, but relatively high. And so, that kind of suggests that, it kind of makes sense, because for the most part, players taken on the third day of the draft don't have a high level of expectation that they're actually going to contribute to a team and stick in the NFL. But it's interesting to me that it's kind of the second round, which is really rough, because I was actually, thinking about this week, because there was someone who had, I think it was Bud Elliott from CBS Sports, had said, looking at your list of players, how far do you think you'd have to go down your list to have every player that's picked in the first round? So how many players would you have to go through until you had all 32? And so I looked back through my data, and last year I only had to go 56 players. The lowest player by expected draft position last year who was drafted in the first round was Titus Howard, offensive tackle from Alabama State by the Houston Texans. But the year before, it was Terrell Edmonds, the safety from Virginia Tech, who was drafted by the Pittsburgh Steelers. So I don't know exactly yet. I don't think I have the perfect methodology yet, and I'm constantly, I'm really looking forward to this offseason to being able to work more on that and refine this and kind of add to the already, I think, pretty decent predictive power of the metric.
And I think when you go back, and at least this has kind of been my experience whenever I've looked at similar things, that it's imperfect data, right? You may not have physical information when it comes to health. You may not have psyche evals, things like that. But then again, especially this year, that information may not be readily available or as trustworthy this go round. And so because of that, we're kind of all operating under the same conditions, so to speak. And so make for a predictable draft, but it's still sports and it's still exciting nonetheless, right?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, and this is what classifies a market, is this asymmetric information. That's kind of Econ 101. So maybe this year we have, it's less of an asymmetric information than in previous years, but I still think that there's still information and edges to be had in the draft. They're probably just pretty small. And Sheil Kapadia for The Athletic wrote a really nice article about the kind of biases and decision-making that can happen in the draft. And one of those things is that you shouldn't believe that you can evaluate talent better than everybody else. Because for the most part, it's borne out that for the most part, teams don't win the draft, they just get lucky.
So let's talk some Cowboys, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, your more sophisticated model, the Loess methodology, says LSU Tiger K'Lavon Chaisson, edge guy listed as a linebacker on your list, will be the Cowboys pick. Tell me about him.
Yeah, so K'Lavon Chaisson, who I just like, to me, it's like one of the better names that's not a nickname, because when I look at like best names in the draft, it's always like Greedy Williams or HaHa Clinton Dix. But K'Lavon Chaisson from LSU, I think I don't think he tested at the combine, but he's thought of as very athletic. And so he played on the edge last year. There's a real great clip of him in LSU's win over Oklahoma, of him chasing down CeeDee Lamb. He's thought of as pretty raw. There's some people who thought he should have gone back to school, but he's going to get drafted in the first round, so I think that they're probably wrong. But yeah, so the Cowboys are constantly looking for that next edge guy, and Chaisson seems to be kind of the marriage of where they think he's valued and where actually in terms of the talent evaluation of him, and then where he's expected to go. I see those kind of lining up sometimes. So that's the difference between mock drafts and big boards. They're supposed to stack the mix of talent and the need of the team or the idea of where they might go. And so Chason fits right into that middle of the first round where the Cowboys are picking. It's a little bit of, I'm really interested to see how the draft, comes out, because like I said, the Cowboys have a reputation, and at least in how I look at the draft, of drafting players at least early, right on expectation or above expectation, or I guess later than expected when you think about it. So when I look back at their last two drafts, 2 years ago, in that first round, they had a player who fell right to them, and so that was really nice. And that was Leighton Vander Esch, the linebacker from Boise State. And then in the second round, they drafted Connor Williams, the offensive tackle from Texas. And both of those picks I thought were very good. So if you're right on expectation, or if you're drafting players a little bit later than expectation, I view those as pretty positive things. And so if they drafted Chason this year, it would be right around expectation, because his kind of expectation, at least in the first round, I think is starting at that middle bit of the round. I think that there's a certain chance that the Atlanta Falcons could draft him if they stay where they are. But I've heard them rumored to be trading up for C.J. Henderson, who I think for a long time Cowboys fans thought, oh, that's kind of where he might be for the team. But he's been a late riser in this draft process. I think there's very little chance that the Cowboys will be able to select C.J. Henderson at this point. But Chason, if you're going to go defense, I think he's a good player to go with value. And when I try to balance the need and the value here, so value for him, it makes sense. He's right there. The value for him, it makes quite good sense. When we look at the mock drafts and we look at which positions the Dallas Cowboys are most mocked, it's the edge rusher. So he's up there. So it's quite a bit of him. There's safety, cornerback, defensive tackle, and wide receiver are the top mock positions for the Cowboys for the first round. So I wouldn't be surprised to see them select, players from any of those positions. And so, I'm excited to talk about some of the other guys that could fit the bill for the Cowboys. But I think Chason would make a lot of sense from a value perspective and from a need perspective.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up that need, because first-year coach Mike McCarthy has said he wants 6 rushers and 4 inside guys along the defensive line. And so if the Cowboys go predictable in the first round, which they've tended to do over the last several years, instead of trading or picking someone completely out of left field who, falls into their lap. Usually we have a pretty good idea as far as what the Cowboys want to do in the first round. And so given that need, to me, this seemed pretty obvious. I don't, personally see how this would go too many other ways. But, of course, things can happen in the draft. You have to be prepared and have contingency plans. And in terms of reports and other guys the Cowboys are interested in, Grant Delpit, the safety out of LSU, Xavier McKinney, safety out of Alabama. You mentioned C.J. Anderson, cornerback from Florida, if he is available at 17. Who among those guys do you think looks intriguing and is worth a conversation here?
So, the C.J. Henderson, if he was there, I think they would pick him pretty fast, because the cornerback need for the team, there's a whole bunch of, they let Byron Jones walk, and he was, one of the more consistently above average to excellent, cornerbacks in the NFL.
Hurts my feelings, but yes, thanks for mentioning.
Yeah. So C.J. Henderson, I think, would be an awesome pick. If he fell, I would wonder why. But the Cowboys have not been one to shy away from players who fall and have been successful in that way. So, to me, Xavier McKinney would make more sense from a value perspective. I have him. He's kind of, I think, around the 20th ranked player by expected draft position. He's kind of viewed as a Swiss Army knife. He kind of played the Minkah Fitzpatrick position at Alabama when Minkah was drafted in 2018 by the Miami Dolphins, and now he's a Pittsburgh Steeler. McKinney inherited that role, and that role is kind of a mix of you rush the passer on blitzes, you cover deep, and then also you're playing some slot corner as well. So he's a very versatile player. So to me, McKinney would make more sense around that pick. It would be a slight reach, but not by very much, given where the Cowboys are selecting. But Delpit is definitely more of a second-round player, but an early second-round player. He had a lot of hype in the beginning of the process. His pedigree was really strong, and he had a really very good sophomore year at LSU. And his junior year, he kind of had a similar kind of treatment that Greedy Williams got last year, which was that, he was viewed as an elite talent, very athletic, great football player. But then this past year, it didn't feel like teams thought that he might have been playing hurt. So how do you evaluate the play when it's subpar, when he might have been playing hurt? So there's a bit of a mix on Delpit, but I don't think that the Cowboys would select him at their pick in the first round. If he managed to fall to their pick in the second round and they hadn't already selected a guy like Xavier McKinney, I think that's a good pick for them for sure.
Katie Drummond, he's been on the podcast before. He points out that the Cowboys love to draft the best at a particular position. Like with Leighton Vander Esch, for instance, in 2018. By their standards, they felt like he was the best linebacker, not just available, but in the draft. And so they went ahead in that particular direction. Sometimes need matters in all of this, for sure. But the goal is to find the best at a particular position just to maximize talent. I think it's one of the reasons why draft surplus value has been so good for them over the years. Now, if I want to have a little fun with this isn't a name that's been floating around very much, but one need, as you mentioned, for the Cowboys is at wide receiver. And specifically, I would say slot wide receiver with the departure of Randall Cobb. Obviously, Cole Beasley was great for the Cowboys for a few years. And the top slot guy seems to be LSU's Justin Jefferson. He's 18th on your aggregate board. What do you think about my logic here?
I like your logic. So to me, the Cowboys Super Bowl window is still intact. They're going to eventually sign Dak. And so to me, I'd love to help Dak. So it makes a lot of sense to me, but I think it'd be a lot of fun. Justin Jefferson, I think would be very good for the team. Then you pair him with Michael Gallup and Amari Cooper, and then you're really cooking. To me, that would be an awesome pick and right on value. And if they wanted the best slot receiver, you can argue that Henry Ruggs from Alabama could be the best in the slot, depending on where you play him. I think he could play outside too. But Jefferson played, the massive share of his snaps last year at LSU, was very productive out of the slot. So to me, put him right in there and let's cook.
Absolutely. That's the way I feel. And, you're an analytics guy as much as I am. That offense matters more in this grand scheme of things. Not that defense doesn't matter, but in terms of scoring a bunch of points, that's how you win football games in this day and age. And Dak especially loves to throw to the slot. And so why not have someone you don't have to worry about at that particular position?
Definitely. And, I think that in the past, people would have thought, tight end is kind of the safety blanket. But to be honest, they've tried to draft tight ends to replace Jason Witten for years, and they might draft another tight end, but I think it would be in the later rounds where more of the value is. But to me, Justin Jefferson will be a great safety blanket, and also is pretty explosive as well. So I think I think people thought he was like a decent athlete, but he tested very well at the combine. And so he can run. So I think he can do a lot of things, and he did quite a bit at LSU. I mean, if you're a Texas fan, you can just remember him going deep, the throw that Joe Burrow had to beat Texas very late. He brings that deep speed as well, and he can jump.
Or if you're an Oklahoma fan, just getting burned pretty much every other snap.
That too.
Also, lots of fan bases from the receiving end, so to speak.
Yeah, equal opportunity.
Let's talk about the second round here. It's always been the fun round for the Cowboys. Either trading or choosing a risky player. At 51 on your aggregate board, you have a running back, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, only among experts. Neville Gallimore, if you're getting everybody in, defensive tackle out of Oklahoma. Second round, historically, more unpredictable for the Cowboys. Any thoughts here as far as what could happen, what you like, anything like that?
Yeah. So last year, they definitely surprised by picking Tristan Hill, the defensive tackle from Central Florida. And so I had him I think that pick was around the 50s, and I think I had him in the hundreds. So that was kind of a surprise given what they like to do. But so to me, looking at the positions of need that I mentioned before, so cornerback, two guys that I think could be available potentially at 51, Noah Igbenogany from Auburn and Damon Arnett from Ohio State. So I think those two guys, because the Cowboys, cornerback, if they could draft wide receiver and then come back and get cornerback, I think you should be very happy. Two premier positions restock the cupboard a little bit when it comes to defensive back. If they want to stay on that defensive line, you mentioned Neville Gallimore. Another guy who's more local is Justin Madubuike from Texas A&M. I guess they're both local now that I come to think about it, because Oklahoma not far from Dallas.
Right.
And then if you're going to go back to safety, well, there's two guys who, I think the Senior Bowl was a huge thing for them, and the Combine specifically for one here, which is Jeremy Chin, who the experts really like. The media and the fan crowd are not as high on Jeremy Chin, the safety from Southern Illinois, who had probably one of the better combines. And I wrote a little blog post for my website, and I looked kind of 2 weeks before the combine and 2 weeks after the combine. And he had the highest rise in terms of average draft position when you looked at the mock drafts then and there. And then another guy who's a small school guy as well. I don't know if the Cowboys have done this too much, so I think I'd be a little surprised, but I think actually they have in the past done some drafting at small schools.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think VW Webb. Yeah. But this would be a little bit higher than maybe, but Kyle Duggar from Lenore-Ryan in North Carolina. So those are some guys that I think would be good in the second round on defense. And then if you look at edge rusher, if they decide not to address that, Marlon Davidson from Auburn. He's a bigger guy, and I feel like I saw a video of the Cowboys Brain Trust interviewing him, so that they like him enough. And he also said that he loves football because he can legally beat up people, so he's a tough guy. And if they really want someone who kind of, I think, profiled is like similar to K'Lavon Chaisson, it's Josh Uche from Michigan. And I know that the Cowboys have had maybe not as great luck drafting players from Michigan, but there's a saying that people say, and the saying is don't scout the helmet. Just because Taco Charlton didn't work out doesn't mean Josh Uche couldn't be great for you guys.
No, you're right. And, with Taco, there were a lot of different things going on there that I think made it volatile to begin with, besides the position and things like that. But, like we talked about before, with the draft surplus value that the Cowboys have been able to maximize, okay, Taco didn't work out. It doesn't mean they're bad at it. It's just, things happen, and you're not. And look, Leighton Vander Esch's long-term health is a question mark, but that's not necessarily something you're going to know. It's a it is a tricky science, to say the least, when it comes to drafting. I did want to ask you, though, as I was looking at your board and looking at some of the later rounds, again, just kind of going by the expert aggregate board here, round 3 for the pick might be like a James Lynch, defensive end from Baylor. Round 4, Jabri Zuniga, defensive end from Florida. But then at 5, round 5, James Morgan, the quarterback from Florida International. And the idea of the Cowboys drafting a quarterback, one, may very well be prudent because having a backup quarterback is mighty important. But at the same time, there will be parts of this Cowboys fan base that will simply, may I move out to D because some of the fan base will be that difficult to deal with, even if it is the right move to make to get someone like James Morgan.
Yeah, just look at what happened with Dak. To be honest, and the story with Dak was always like, I think the story was that they like Connor Cook, who got drafted by the Raiders.
Yeah.
And, so you can get lucky at that point. And, I don't think that they need a quarterback. There's a certain school that believes you should draft one quarterback every year just to see what might happen at a later point in the draft. And so, for example, I'm a Bengals fan. And last year in the draft, I think in the 4th round, they drafted Ryan Finley from North Carolina State. I don't necessarily like Ryan Finley that much. They brought him in for a visit. So to me, it was like the only quarterback, if they were going to draft a quarterback at that point, was going to be him. And I was fine with it because it's the 4th round, to be honest. And he played this year, and he's part of the reason why the Bengals have the number 1 pick. So it worked out in a different way. But yeah, I think it's not a bad idea. James Morgan, you're right. He's like the 8th ranked quarterback by experts in my model. But, I think Anthony Gordon from Washington State profiles really well as somebody who's an accurate passer. And then there's also some love for Jake Luton from Oregon State. So James Morgan is an interesting story because he kind of bounced around. He lost a starting job to, I think, an incoming freshman at Bowling Green, which is where he started at. And so interesting quarterback profile for him. I think that the quarterback before him, according to the experts, is Jalen Hurts. And I think a lot of people are going to be interested in seeing where he goes because it'll tell you a little bit about how the NFL values players who have kind of plus athleticism when it comes to rushing. So the Cowboys have occasionally, used Dak in some schemed runs. And so, I think it'd be very interesting to get Jalen Hurts for them, but I think it would be in the third round and not at a point where they feel like it makes sense given their current state in terms of the Super Bowl championship window. Because I still think the team is capable of doing that, especially if the offense regresses this year, which I think is pretty likely given how good Dak has been, and it's still in it's still an incentive for him to perform really well because he wants to get paid, and he wants to get paid at an elite level. So which I think he rightfully deserves.
Absolutely. He certainly does that. And I think also he wants to, be able to call the shots in terms of the terms, how many years and things like that. And definitely playing well would help as far as that's concerned. I also want to talk about the top of the board, I guess, from an NFL league-wide perspective. Obviously, your Bengals, you know what they're going to do. No reason to do anything differently there. At 2, it certainly seems like Washington's going to take Chase Young. On the one hand, best player in the draft. On the other hand, he, plays a position that, it's harder to maximize your value there at number 2 overall. Do you feel like that we could have some real fireworks right around 3 or 4 or 5?
Oh, I mean, definitely. There's so many rumors going on. It's really hard to know what's true. Mm-hmm. And so to me, I think that it would be prudent for, any of the teams outside of the Bengals. So that's, Washington, that's the Lions, and the Giants. It would be prudent for all of them to trade back, really. So to be honest, the teams that are wanting to trade up, if you can kind of play those teams against each other, you might even get a better deal. But yeah, to me, those teams all have needs. And so to be honest, people have this view that one elite player is going to move the needle for you, when in reality, having, 3 above average players could move the needle for you even more. So especially at that position like pass rusher, and Chase Young is definitely great at what he does. He's definitely kind of a presidential prospect. He's kind of the best player at his position, probably at least in the past couple of years. Though the Bosa brothers still have something to say about that for sure. But yeah, so to me, it really gets interesting because of the trades. And for the most part, some mock drafts incorporate some level of trades and some don't. So to be honest, what I'm showing on my site is kind of a very chalky projection. And people tend to kind of, like I said, people are biased. People create mock drafts. People read other people's mock drafts or kind of fall into a certain opinion, and people don't necessarily change their mind that much. So, my top 5 seems pretty, set in stone, but in reality, it might not. So right now, in the data that I just updated, actually, I'm just now noticing this. Justin Herbert has inched ahead of Tua Tagovailoa in the 4th spot behind Jeffrey Okudah by 0.3 points of expected draft position. So I think there's a little bit of a late buzz of Justin Herbert to be the pick at number 3. But at the same time, I've been hearing online all day today, people saying that the Dolphins wanted to trade up to offensive tackle. And so both of those things sound less enticing than drafting Tua Tagovailoa to me. But I view the situation a little bit, and I've mentioned this a couple times to some friends, that I view the situation like Tua is like the Joel Embiid of this draft, where his potential is really high, but there is some inherent risk in drafting him because of his health situation. And so to me, the team that drafts him should view this as a long-term investment a little bit. He may not play in his first year, or maybe this season will probably be really different anyway, just given the current situation. But to me, a prudent team would make a long-term investment rather than just drafting the guy who could play now and be okay. I'd rather draft a guy who, you wait, he could be excellent. But yeah, there's a lot of movement, in this top 10. I think it'll be pretty exciting. I hope there's some trades. Last year, we didn't really get a lot of trades in the top part of the draft. And so that was kind of a little less exciting. But there'll definitely be some boos and whatnot virtually from people who believe that, their team traded for the wrong guy or didn't take the quarterback that they wanted. And so to me, teams like the Cowboys can kind of benefit quite a bit. And the Cowboys are a top 5 team when it comes to this draft surplus value. But there's other teams that are kind of with them. The Baltimore Ravens, the Tennessee Titans, teams that kind of just say, hey, you guys are going to take players, whatever. I'm just going to take, for the most part, the players that are kind of just falling. And so, I did a mock draft last night live on this Twitch stream that the Action Network did, and a player that I've projected pretty high, Isaiah Simmons from Clemson, fell all the way to the Falcons at 16. So, there's things like that can happen, and that's what makes the draft really fun and exciting. So I'm really excited to see how it turns out tomorrow night. And I also said that tomorrow is going to kind of be like my Sabbath, because after tomorrow, I don't have to collect mock drafts anymore for a while. I can just sit back and enjoy the draft and analyze my data, which is what I love to do anyway.
No doubt. And I was just updating your website as you were talking, and sure enough, Herbert's at 4, Tua is at 5, Tristan Wirfs, offensive tackle from Iowa, is at 6, and then Isaiah Simmons, the linebacker at Clemson, at 7. That one is interesting, given sort of the range available. Last question,
for the experts, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Last question I have for you. What's next for grindingthemocks.com? Because I know there are a lot of extensions that you can create and question going forward in terms of how well teams draft, how well teams mock, things like that. What are some of the next projects that you're looking at?
So to me, one of the things that I feel that happens in my data is to me the ranges on this, the upper and lower limits on the site, I think are definitely they're way too small for a lot of players. Just because, and this is an important lesson. So there's a lot of talk about big data, right? And so big data can actually be really problematic because, I'll give you an example. So there's the classic example of, the mean and the median, right? So if we're in a room and Bill Gates enters the room, the median income should stay the same, but the mean will go up quite a bit. So the problem I have in the draft is a little bit of the opposite. So the draft is a very constricted space when we think about it statistically and mathematically. Like, there's only a certain number of picks. So to be honest, there's quite a bit of groupthink. And so to me, what I'm trying to do over this offseason is kind of do a little bit more R&D and kind of come up with a little bit of a more sophisticated way of finding out what a player's actual range statistically is. And so that's what I'm looking forward to spending a lot of time on over the offseason, is investing in some R&D. The other thing I'm really interested in doing is doing some analysis of kind of, this is a little more academic to me. It's not as practical necessarily, but I'm really interested in kind of clustering players based on their draft stock curves, to kind of how it changes over time. And so I'm really interested in kind of finding players who kind of might have had a similar kind of draft experience, and then looking at some outcomes data. So, the classic academic research by Massey and Thaler looked at kind of very basic measures around the number of starts that players had. But there's other pieces of public information like Pro Football Reference's approximate value. And so I'm also interested in beginning to do some research about, how well does expected draft position predict something like approximate value. So we're not just looking at draft surplus value from efficiency in the draft, but maybe there's something in the mock drafts that also can tell us something about what a player's expected, production could be, or approximate value could be. I don't know if there's any relationship there, but in addition to doing some R&D to kind of make the kind of estimates more realistic and more statistically valid and more predictively powerful, I'm also interested in seeing, if we can look at players' draft curves, and also trying to see what we can find in terms of outcomes, because I'm very interested in the draft process. But eventually, when I have enough data, and we're beginning to get there a little bit, after I think this next season, I'll feel good about doing some more of that, but I'll kind of probably begin the process of investigating that a little bit as well.
Benjamin Robinson, thank you so much for this conversation. This was excellent.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Edward. And if people want to check out the site, it's grindingthemocks.com. And if they want to follow me on social media, I'm fairly active on Twitter, and I try to answer as many questions that are reasonable as possible. And so they can find me at VENJ_Robinson on Twitter.
Absolutely. And I will go ahead and repeat those one more time. Grindingthemocks.com is the website. Again, if you really are into this NFL draft stuff, keep that browser open and keep refreshing it. A lot of great information there. And of course, Benjamin Robinson on Twitter at BENJ_Robinson. And I'm Edward Egros. Thank you so much for checking out this installment of Cowboys Deep Cuts. Have a great day and enjoy the draft.
Cowboys Deep Cuts is a production of Vocal. For more information and more programming, please visit vocalnow.com. That's VOKAL now.com.